How could I have known that a simple thunderstorm would change everything between us? The house shook with each crack of lightning and the rain pounded against the windows like angry fists. I had been tossing and turning for hours in my empty bed, the sheets cold and unwelcoming. That's when I heard Mason's voice calling out from down the hall. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, clearer this time. "Rebecca, are you awake?" His voice carried a hint of vulnerability I'd never heard before. I left my room and pulled my robe around me and made my way to his room. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the room was dimly lit, and I paused for a moment at the door. Mason was sitting in bed, the covers loose around him, looking troubled. His hair was tousled, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. I froze in the doorway, aware of how hastily I had dressed. I hesitated. "I'm sorry," he said softly. He looked at me with an unreadable expression. "The storm, it's just, I've never liked them since I was a kid." I stepped into the room trying to ignore the strange flutter in my chest. After all, Mason was my stepson. Even if at 26 he wasn't really a child anymore. I've been married to his father, Richard, for just 3 years. But Richard was always away on business trips, leaving Mason and me alone in this big house more often than not. We'd developed a comfortable friendship, but tonight felt different. There was a charge in the air that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. "Do you want me to stay until you fall asleep?" I offered, remembering how I used to comfort my younger sisters during storms. Mason's eyes lit up with something that looked like relief, but maybe there was something else there too. "Would you?" he asked, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Like when I was younger?" I hesitated for just a moment before nodding and moving toward the bed. As I sat down on the edge, I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Another crash of thunder made me jump, and instinctively I moved closer to him. "Seems like I might need the company too," I said with a nervous laugh. Mason smiled, and something in that smile made my heart beat a little faster. "Then stay," he said, lifting the covers invitingly. "There's plenty of room." I knew I should say no. I knew this crossed some invisible line, but the storm outside was fierce, and the thought of returning to my cold, empty bed seemed unbearable. So I slipped under the covers, careful to maintain a respectable distance between us. But as another bolt of lightning illuminated the room, I saw Mason watching me, his eyes reflecting something that sent a shiver down my spine. We lay there in silence, listening to the rain, but I could feel something building between us, something quiet but powerful, like the calm at the center of the storm. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, I was disoriented, but then I felt a warm presence beside me. Mason was still asleep, his face peaceful. I carefully extracted myself, my heart pounding as I realized how intimate this position was. Had we moved closer during the night? I couldn't remember. The comfort of his presence was undeniable. I slipped out of his room and back to mine, but the memory of waking up next to him lingered like a persistent echo. That day, everything seemed different. Mason and I moved around each other with a new awareness, our casual interaction suddenly filled with unspoken emotions. When our hands brushed as we both reached for the coffee pot, I felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the storm from the night before. Mason seemed to feel it too, his eyes meeting mine with a question I wasn't ready to answer. We spent the day in a strange dance, drawing closer and then pulling away, like waves approaching and retreating from the shore. In the afternoon, Mason asked me to help him move some boxes in the attic. "Dad wants me to sort through some old stuff," he explained. As I followed him up the narrow stairs, I couldn't help but notice how his shoulders had broadened since he'd moved back home after college. The attic was dusty and warm, with sunlight filtering through a small window. "Could you grab that box on the top shelf?" Mason asked, pointing to a storage area against the wall. I nodded and stretched up on my tiptoes, reaching for the box. As I did, stretched for the box, feeling the fabric shift, I heard Mason's sharp intake of breath behind me and turned to find him watching me intently, his eyes fixed on that exposed patch of skin. When he realized I'd caught him looking, he quickly averted his gaze, but not before I saw the appreciation there. Something stirred inside me, a warmth that spread from my core outward. I was 43, and it had been a long time since anyone had looked at me that way, with genuine desire. Richard certainly hadn't in years. "Sorry," Mason mumbled, but he didn't look sorry at all. "Let me help you with that." He stepped closer, his presence reassuring as he reached above my head for the box. For a moment, we were pressed together, and I could feel the solid warmth of him against my back. Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. That evening, we ate dinner in a silence heavy with unspoken words. The air between us had shifted, charged with a current neither of us was willing to acknowledge. When Mason's phone rang, breaking the silence, I jumped. It was Richard, calling to say he'd be gone for another week. I watched Mason's face as he listened to his father, noticing the tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. When he hung up, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "He's not coming back until next Friday," he said, his voice flat. I nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of something that felt dangerously like anticipation. Another week alone with Mason stretched before us, full of possibility. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, a knock at my door made me pause in brushing my hair. I tightened my robe and called out, "Come in." Mason stood in the doorway looking uncertain. "Another storm's coming," he said, his eyes meeting mine in the mirror. "I heard it on the weather report." I turned to face him, brush still in hand. "Are you asking if you can stay with me tonight?" The words slipped out before I could stop them, bolder than I'd intended. Mason's eyes widened slightly, but then he stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Would that be so wrong?" he asked softly. I knew the answer should be yes, it would be wrong. He was my stepson. There were boundaries we shouldn't cross, but as I looked at him standing there, vulnerability and desire mingling in his expression, I couldn't bring myself to send him away. "One more night," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "because of the storm." We both knew there was no storm yet, that it might not come at all, but the pretense gave us permission to cross a line we'd been approaching for days. We lay side by side in my bed, a careful distance between us, both staring at the ceiling. The air conditioner hummed softly, but it did nothing to cool the heat building between us. "Rebecca," Mason said finally, turning to face me, "I can't stop thinking about you." His honesty took my breath away. In that moment, all the reasons why we shouldn't were drowned out by the one powerful reason why we should. We both wanted this, had been wanting it for longer than either of us was ready to admit. "I know," I whispered back. "I feel it too." The admission hung in the air between us, changing everything. Mason reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, but I didn't. His hand cupped my cheek, his touch gentle but certain. When his lips met mine, the kiss was brief, tentative, a question more than a demand. I answered by leaning in, deepening the connection just for a moment before we both pulled back, breathing harder than before. "This is crazy," I said, but I made no move to create more distance between us. Mason nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "Completely crazy," he agreed. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" I couldn't lie, not to him and not to myself. "No," I admitted. "It feels like the most natural thing in the world." And it did. Despite everything that should have made this impossible, our age difference, our relationship, Richard, Being with Mason felt right in a way nothing had in years. Over the next few days, we existed in a strange new reality. On the surface, nothing had changed. We ate meals together, watched TV, went about our daily routines. But underneath, everything was different. Our hands would brush accidentally as we passed each other in the hallway. Our conversations were laced with double meanings and lingering glances. At night, Mason would come to my room or I to his, and we would lie together, sometimes talking until dawn, sometimes just holding each other, navigating this new closeness with cautious curiosity. One evening, Mason suggested we have a glass of wine on the back porch. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the air was warm and fragrant with summer flowers. "Remember when you first moved in?" Mason asked, his voice thoughtful. "I was so resentful. I thought you were trying to replace my mom." I nodded, sipping my wine. "I know, you made that pretty clear." We both laughed at the memory of his teenage sullenness, his deliberate efforts to make me feel unwelcome. "And now look at us," he said softly, his eyes holding mine. "Mason," I began, setting my glass down. "What are we doing? Your father—" He shook his head, cutting me off. "Don't talk about him, not now." There was an edge to his voice that surprised me. "He's never here. He's never been here, not really. Not for me, and not for you either." His words hit home with painful accuracy. Richard was a ghost in our lives, always absent, always putting work first. "But that doesn't make this right," I whispered, even as I leaned closer to Mason. "Nothing about this is right or wrong," he said, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. "It just is." His touch lingered, his fingers trailing down my neck to my collarbone. "You're so beautiful," he murmured. "I've always thought so, even when I was trying to hate you." The admission sent a thrill through me. I knew I should pull away, set boundaries, be the adult in the situation. But I was tired of being the responsible one, tired of denying myself what I wanted. That night, we crossed another line. Mason's room was bathed in moonlight as we sat on his bed, talking about nothing and everything. When he reached for me, pulling me closer, there was a new urgency in his touch. His hands traced gentle patterns in the air, his eyes asking a question I answered by leaning into him. The tension between us was impossible to ignore. In that moment, there was only Mason and me, desire and need, momentarily forgetting about the outside world. He held me gently, and we drew closer, his touch both gentle and insistent. I responded in kind, exploring the hard planes of his chest, the strength in his arms. The boundaries between us dissolved, replaced by a connection so intense it took my breath away. We forgot everything around us, lost in the moment. The moonlight painted our skins silver as we moved together, finding a harmony that felt natural between us. Every touch, every movement was a revelation. Mason whispered my name like a prayer, his voice breaking with emotion. I clung to him, lost in sensations I'd forgotten were possible. The world narrowed to just this room, just this moment, just the two of us creating something beautiful and dangerous and completely irresistible. Time lost all meaning as we surrendered to what we'd both been wanting. Afterward, as we lay tangled together, reality began to seep back in around the edges of our perfect moment. What had we done? What would happen next? Mason's arm tightened around me as if sensing my thoughts. "Don't overthink this," he murmured against my hair. "Just feel." I tried to follow his advice, to stay in the moment, but questions and concerns clouded my mind. This couldn't last. Richard would return. Life would intrude. But for now, in the circle of Mason's arms, I allowed myself to believe in the possibility of happiness. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and secret smiles. We existed in our own world, separate from reality. I knew it couldn't last, that eventually we would have to face the consequences of our actions, but I couldn't bring myself to end it. Not when being with Mason made me feel more alive than I had in years. Not when the thought of going back to my lonely existence seemed unbearable. Then came the call. Richard would be home tomorrow, a day earlier than expected. The news hit me like a physical blow. Mason watched my face as I hung up the phone, his expression hardening. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "He calls and we just pretend this never happened?" I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "What choice do we have?" I asked softly. "He's your father, my husband." Mason moved closer, taking my hands in his. "We could leave," he said, his voice intense. "Just go, start over somewhere new, together." The suggestion took my breath away. Could we really do that? Leave everything behind for this connection that defied all logic but felt more real than anything in my life? "Think about it," Mason urged. "We have until tomorrow to decide." That night, as Mason slept beside me, I lay awake, my mind racing. The steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body against mine, the peace I felt in his presence. Could I give all this up? Return to the cold, polite fiction of my marriage? But the alternative was unthinkable. The scandal, the hurt it would cause, the burned bridges. Richard didn't deserve that, no matter how neglectful he'd been. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke to Mason watching me, his eyes soft in the morning light. Without a word, he leaned down and kissed me, a kiss full of longing and something that felt dangerously like love. He reached for my hand under the covers, holding it quietly. This might be the last time, I thought, and the knowledge made every touch more precious, more intense. Mason's presence awakened feelings I thought I'd forgotten. I responded with equal fervor, memorizing the feel of him, the taste, the sound of his breath catching when I touched him just right. The world outside ceased to exist as we moved together, sharing a closeness that felt timeless. We held each other tightly, overwhelmed by the intensity of our feelings. In that moment, I knew this wasn't just physical. This was something deeper, stronger, more dangerous than mere desire. As we lay together afterward, the weight of our decision hung heavy in the air. Stay and face the consequences, or go and create something new. The clock was ticking. In just hours, Richard would be home, and everything would change. Mason traced patterns on my skin, his touch both comforting and electrifying. "Whatever you decide," he whispered, "know that this was real. What we have is real." I looked into his eyes, searching for the answer to a question I wasn't sure how to ask. Was this love? Was it worth the cost? Could something built on such a shaky foundation survive in the real world? Mason held my gaze, patient, waiting for me to come to a decision that would change both our lives forever. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, marking the passage of time we couldn't stop, I realized that whatever choice I made would define me from this moment forward. Would I choose the safe path, the expected one, or would I take a leap into the unknown with this man who made me feel things I'd thought were lost to me forever? As I looked at Mason, his eyes full of hope and possibility, I knew what my heart wanted. But was I brave enough to listen to it? What would you do if you were standing at the edge of everything familiar, with happiness just a decision away?
This is an artistic and fictional creation intended for both entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual people or events is purely coincidental. Some scenes and dialogues in the video are part of a dramatized performance and incorporate elements of grotesque, satire, and exaggeration. The creator stands against discrimination, violence, and hatred. This channel fully complies with YouTube's policies and does not infringe upon copyright laws.